interesting speech by Petteri Pietikäinen from the University of Oulu. And the speech would be about the problem of mass immigration and gender studies at the University of Chicago during the 1910 and 1930.
It's a long title. Yes, buongiorno, everyone. I will stand while I talk. It's more natural for me. All right. So, the theme of this session is Voyage and immigration. Miki took care of the voyage part and I take care of the immigration part. They are both very small issues.
We can't hear you.
You can't hear me?
No.
This has a bad acoustics. I don't like microphones either.
No.
I have to do that. Like this. Okay. So the reason I'm studying immigration is not the immigration itself. I'm not the historian of immigration really, but what I'm interested in is what the title of that book from the 1930s says. It's the idea of adjustment, the adjustment discourse. In this case, it's personal and social adjustment, but there are also other epithets related to the idea of adjustment, including racial adjustment. And what is meant by adjustment is something that today is often called integration. But the term itself is still in use. If you Google the word adjustment, you can see terms such as adjustment to climate change, adjustment to lifelong learning, or adjustment to financial crisis. So I'm interested in the ways in which the social researchers in Chicago, and to some extent also elsewhere, because many graduates from the University of Chicago and Northwestern University went to other universities, but they kept on studying issues that were more or less related to urban sociology. And I'm preparing a book on the question of social adjustment of European immigrants and African Americans from southern states, how the scholars perceive their social problems, but also their level of adjustment in this increasingly growing city. How they talk about immigrants and what conclusions did they draw on the life of these immigrant groups and also African Americans. I changed the slides.
So you want me to...
Could you do that? I could more small. Thanks very much. Just to establish the context for my presentation, I would like to mention something about immigration to the US. It was huge from the late 19th century to the around mid-1920s when the increasingly exclusionary immigration laws came to effect, especially the so-called quota laws. And more than 20 million immigrants came to the States during this period, and that was more than in any other period before or after. This is called, in the scholarly literature, this is called the second wave of mass immigration. The first wave occurred in the earlier 19th century when lots of people from Germany, Ireland, Sweden, especially from those countries, England also came to Scotland, came to the US. And during the second wave, the majority of immigrants came from Central Europe, Eastern and Southern Europe. Lots of Poles, lots of Italians, especially from the area of Mezzogiorno, from the southern parts, and from Sicily and Sardinia. and lots of Jews, many Jews from Russia and Poland and Austria-Hungary. And one destination, very popular destination for these immigrants was Chicago, which was growing at enormous speed at the time. There was also industry, meatpacking industry. Chicago is very well known for that, and also steel industry, textile industry. And it was also a very important hub for the railways. So in 1930, the population of Chicago was 3.5 million. It's more than it is today. In fact, it was probably the third biggest city in the world at that time, after London and New York. And close to 25% of the inhabitants in Chicago were foreign born. And if you count people who were second generation immigrants, the percentage is even more. I would say that perhaps more than half the inhabitants of Chicago had immigrant background, or by 1930 there were increasing number of African Americans also in Chicago. And they started to move to Chicago during the First World War because there was a shortage of labor. A couple of books dealing with this issue. One is a contemporary book by Emily Green Balch about our Slavic fellow citizens, quite sympathetic account of the Slavic immigrants. And then there's a scholarly work by Rosie Daniels, Not Like Us, Immigrants and Minorities in America. Exactly from that book. Please, the next slide. And this is a picture of Chicago, the tenement area. You don't see too many parks in the photo. This is obviously a working class district. And most immigrants were peasant origin or peasant origin from Europe, and they became working class people in the US and in Chicago. And Chicago was really increasing, the population was increasing in enormous speed. Right, so the next slide, please. This is also from Chicago. This is the W.E.B area, the central financial district of Chicago. And there's the river, right? It's called Chicago River, right? Sure. Right. And very important single work that was instrumental in launching empirical sociology in the US was a book that is there, cover, The Polish Peasant in Europe and America. The title itself can be a bit misleading, that why is a book in which the Polish peasant is studied so important? But it is important because both of these authors, one is pioneer sociologist from the University of Chicago, William Isaac Thomas, and the other author is Polish philosopher Florian Staniewski. They compiled a huge amount of so-called eco documents, letters, memoirs, and autobiographies of Polish peasants, and they produced a 5-volume work. And especially important for the development of sociology was the first volume and the first chapter, which was called Methodological Notes. And also the concept and theory of social disorganization was very important, especially for the Chicago School of Sociology. Okay, the next slide, please. So the study of immigration groups was quite important for the sociologists in Chicago. Please, the next slide. I will, yeah. Yes, and the Chicago School of Sociology has been studied quite a lot, especially the institutional history of Chicago School, and also some of their major theoretical frames and approaches such as the ecology, urban ecology, so forth. But what I'm interested in is how they describe the people in Chicago and the immigrant neighborhoods, so-called natural areas in Chicago. And one could describe the whole Chicago School of Sociology. Its prime time was from the 1910s to, well, the mid-1930s. The first and second generation of Chicago sociologists were active at that time. And what has been considered as a major contribution of Chicago School of Sociology is that they focus on the everyday life of the inhabitants of Chicago. You know, they, especially graduate students, they wrote their dissertations on topics such as hobos, organized crime in Chicago, vice areas in Chicago, gangs in Chicago, the natural areas in Chicago, suicide in Chicago, mental disorders in Chicago, prostitution, dance halls, and so forth. And what I'm doing is I'm reading these studies, and I try to figure out how did they describe these mainly immigrant neighborhoods, and what sort of theories did they use and apply when they discuss these groups, and how did they perceive their level of adjustment of these groups. And they often use maps and statistics, and these kinds of maps you can find in most of the studies that were published during this era. In this case, this gives an indication of the juvenile delinquency rates in Chicago, and the darker the color, the more there was juvenile delinquency in Chicago. The Loop area and the area to the west of the Loop was quite disorganized, the disorganized area, and so was the so-called South Side where the African Americans moved. And you can find these maps in most of the studies conducted by these sociologists. Please, the next slide. But what I have found out is that before the publication of the Polish Peasant in the first two volumes I think came in 1980, there were female scholars in Chicago who were also social activists who had already studied immigrants in Chicago for approximately 2 decades. And the important center of such investigations was the settlement house, Bois, which was located in the midst of this natural area. There were, for example, Greeks in that area, probably Poles and Jews and so forth. And Jane Addams was the co-founder of the Pool House, and she herself wrote books about the life of ordinary people in Chicago. And then there was a younger generation of female scholars, including the Abbott sisters over there, Grace and Edith Abbott. One of them was an economist, and the other one was a sociologist. And they were very active not only as investigators of housing conditions, labor market, delinquency, juvenile delinquency especially, but they were also active in reformist organizations, especially Grace Abbott, who was the director of the Juvenile Protection Institutes in Chicago. And these female scholars, they wrote articles and books during the first 2 decades of the 20th century. Here are some of the books. The Immigrant and the Community, for example, for Grace Abbott. Her sister wrote large long immigration select documents and case reports. And then also Edith Abbott wrote a book about the historical aspects of immigration problem. And the woman on the right-hand side below the Abbott sisters is Sophonisba Breckinridge. He was another major scholar in the field that was then called social work. But she had a degree in both in political science and law. And beside her is the picture of Marian Talbot, who became the dean of the institution when it was annexed by the University of Chicago in the early 1920s. So there was lots of studies already before publication of the Polish Peasant in 1980. And there was interaction between the academic sociologists and the people at Hull House. William Thomas, for example, visited Hull House every now and then and gave presentations and so forth. But the actual influence of these female scholars was quite small and the influence on the academic sociology in the US. Can I have the next one, please? So these pioneers, they combine social research with reformist aspirations that were related to like concrete problems of families and women and girls, especially like housing, education, recreation. They wanted to have more public parks. As you can see from that one picture, there were not that many parks in the working class neighborhoods. They wanted to have the full suffrage for women, and they were studying juvenile delinquency. So very practical and important problems during that era. But what happened was that their pioneer work was not totally, but by and large, not acknowledged by the academic sociology in Chicago or elsewhere. I haven't seen many references by these male sociologists, these studies by female scholars. For example, the leading Chicago sociologist, together with William Thomas, who had to leave university because of a sex scandal. It was really nothing, but he had to leave the university and he went to New York. Robert E.B, who had a background in journalism, he was a crime reporter in the 1890s for 10 years or so before he started his dissertation, doctoral studies at Harvard. And Robert E.B was suspicious towards what he called reformist do-gooders and moralists. And that might have affected the way these female scholars were perceived by the sociologists, most of whom were Parks students. And on top of that, political culture in the city of Chicago was and continued to be dominated by what we could call male prerogatives. Business first, business and technology. And these like public parks or public beaches are not that important as to now boost the business. So the so-called machine politics was quite hard in Chicago, remained quite male-dominated. This is one excellent study about these reformist female scholars seeing with their hearts Chicago women and the vision of the good city. Can I have the next one, please? And now to the idea of epistemic hierarchy, which has been developed, especially in the field of the history of knowledge. It is very useful in the case of my own studies. Namely, there was gender hierarchy that was called intra and interspecific. And in the case of intra-specific hierarchy, the simple truth that for the female academics, the career opportunities were much more scarce than for the male academics. And then there was interspecific hierarchy, namely that the more female the discipline, the less global its scientific status. And those female scholars represented by a large social work or household administration or pedagogy. And then there was epistemic hierarchy, namely the less rigorous disciplines, scientifically less rigorous disciplines considered to be less scientific than some other disciplines, and less theory and experimentally based, had a lower epistemic and hence academic status. And again, we are talking about the same discipline, social work, pedagogy, household administration. And with the introduction of this concept, I have mentioned the social disorganization, which really is a theory about social control and loss of social control among the immigrant groups, especially the second generation immigrant groups. The Chicago School of Sociology, in a way, attained a new level of theoretical innovation, and it had a higher epistemic status than social work or household administration. And this is quite obvious when you look at the publications produced by the sociologists and criminologists in Chicago and elsewhere. There are very, very few references to these female scholars and their work, even though they made observations about the life of these immigrant groups that the later male sociologists repeated. They made the same observations maybe 10 years later or 20 years later. But what the main sociologists did was that they related these observations to the idea of social disorganization or some other theory or concept that was developed in Chicago at that time. The next one, please. I think it's the last one. Yeah, the conclusion is the women leading the way will probably be the title of the first chapter of my book. They will lead the way, but their contributions were considered inferior in the epistemic culture of the early 20th century. And it's true that when you look at these publications by these reformist scholars, you can see traces of middle-class moralism, and it may have something to do with the influence of the Bois, especially the early history of Hull House. It was established in 1889 already. And of course, the whole progressivist movement had a touch of not elitism, on the contrary, they wanted to be anti-elitist, but they were mostly like these female scholars, they were progressivists. They wanted to improve the social conditions of people. But they have their own middle class backgrounds, and it sometimes shows in their the ways in which they describe the working class immigrants. But the leading scholars, especially the Abbott sisters and this difficult to pronounce Sophonisba, Breckinridge, that's my argument, they were social engineers rather than moralist tutors in their approach to the social questions. That means that they wanted to compile robust knowledge about the immigrant groups in Chicago, and they compiled statistics and so forth, and only then did they write their publications. They wanted to reform society based on scientific knowledge, and you don't see much moralism in the writings of the Abbott system, for example. And in that sense, they reminded me of the great Swedish social engineers, Alva and Gunnar Myrdal, who had the same sort of trust in science and scientific knowledge, and to the idea that with scientific knowledge we can improve social conditions, make society more rational, and develop more efficient citizenship also. And I guess you might know that Gunnar Myrdal has a direct link with the US. I know that David knows about this, and David is to Namely, Gunnar Myrdal was invited to write a study of the African Americans in the States because he represented the neutral country with no colonial history. Sweden has some colonial history, but not that much compared to England or Britain or Germany. And Gunnar Myrdal wrote a classic book called The American Dilemma. Right. And this is really my argument that because of this epistemic hierarchy, there's also a gender hierarchy. The achievements of these female scholars were more or less neglected. If they had been male scholars, they would not that much, and they would not have been that easily neglected. But this is what happened. All right, one more, because there is a picture of Michel Antonian thing. This is Monica Vitti, and it's in a movie that is placed in Rome, at least to some extent. His famous trilogy from the early 60s, I think. Yeah, grazie. Thanks very much.
Let me ask you a question before asking for questions from the audience. More than a question is a suggestion for further research for you. I wonder at which extent this kind of research make the leadership research in Chicago School led by Stojo. I don't know if you have ever researched about leadership, but it seems to me that leadership, and Stojo, Chicago Stojo, is the most famous leadership scholar in the 30s, between the 30s and the 40s. He was based in Chicago. So it seems to me that much of the problem they raised and the methodologies they used is very similar to what Stojo used for leadership research. Stojo is famous for his traits theory. So from psychology, from sociology, from sociological point of view, this could be quite interesting.
Right, thanks.
If there is any link between these early studies and Stojo studies on leadership, and how much they make the Stojo studies on leadership.
Well, several some questions and then general comment, but also some question. Okay, so here we have these social scientists, gender male, and we have these reformers who also went and investigated these various social problems and delinquents, et cetera, in Chicago. And yes, it seems that the female investigators and reformers were no doubt more explicitly moral in the middle class way, et cetera, But I actually think that a lot of these social scientists were implicitly moral and social engineering as well. They just tried to hide it in their professionalized so-called scientific rhetoric. In fact, they have plenty of moral assessments and judgments and programs for social engineering, especially, they're all funded by Rockefeller, so especially, the Rockefeller funders knew they were social engineering, to be sure. But another unrelated issue that I just thought would be kind of interesting for you, because people usually take the Chicago sociologists as almost like the origins of modern American sociology, and you point to this gender hierarchy Well, it's also very interesting. I've been interested in W.E.B. Du Bois lately, as I've told you, the investigator actually. And Du Bois, the black African American activist and social scientist and historian. He studied at the University of Berlin under Gustav Schmoller, and he used all kinds of statistical methodology as well as qualitative methodology. Bill Todd was there, he went to some of his lectures. So the question that people are now asking in the United States, though we kind of know the answer already, why isn't Du Bois considered the first modern American sociologist, and why are the Chicago guys considered to have initiated American, modern, American sociology? Because Du Bois does a lot of the same stuff that these guys do. He looks at Philadelphia, he draws maps, goes and talks to people, he includes statistical data, et cetera, and yet he was not integrated into, this model of what American sociology is supposed to be. Here is another issue of hierarchy, in this case, racial hierarchy, and other issues of networking, et cetera.
Yes, for those black social scientists, the option was to find a tenure in an African American university, not in the white university. It was, I don't know how difficult it was until 1950s or 60s. I think Du Bois was also a professor in some of these African American universities. It was, of course, okay that they had a position. Yeah, Du Bois is another, it's a very good example of what you call the racial hierarchy, what is racial prejudice.
Well, you can ask why didn't the Rockefellers fund the sociological laboratory at Atlanta University, where Du Bois, why didn't they fund him? They funded these other guys, but whatever. Actually, it was too early to fund him.
Their skin color had nothing to do with it. Very good points. I didn't mention the African Americans in this presentation because I only have 20 minutes. But I will write a chapter on the African Americans, their adjustments.
Yeah, just kind of a prologue. I mean, it's not really the case that American sociology started at Chicago, and other, sciences women investigators and other folks too.
Did you ask something?
No.
Okay.
I was also curious about what happened to Florence Kelly, but you don't have to deal with that.
Makes you go to autobiography. You don't like.
More question? Please.
This was very nice, thank you. I don't know if it's a question or a comment, but I mean, it's more about when we study, in the case of women, what I came to realize myself is that it's true that there is an epistemic hierarchy as you described, and that's because they were doing social work, and social work as a discipline was less considered than sociology, for example. The work of these women was less considered, but at the same time, they were the only spaces where women could also progress in the hierarchy of the academic hierarchy. And so the example of Sophonisba, Breckinridge, having a degree in political science and using it to do social work and to just be in academia in a department of social work in Chicago, which was completely female dominated compared to the Department of Sociology in Chicago at the same time, is actually very telling in that way. So it was at the same time they had to confine themselves in these small spaces where they could actually do an academic career, and at the same time, in disciplines that were less considered serious in academia.
That's a very good point, and that's very true. Gave them an opportunity to do academic research. And in the early 1920s, the School of Civics and Philanthropy, it was a small school, badly funded, in which these women were employed. It became part of the University of Chicago.
Yeah.
So the University of Chicago took the institute.
But
became part of
even when it was the graduate school of, I think it was social administration,
Yes.
it was completely kept apart from the Department of Sociology,
Right.
even though they were doing the same kind
Yes.
of research. And interesting fact also is that all these women remained single. They were not, I mean, the Abbott sisters of Elizabeth Breckinridge, they were single, they were wives. Whereas all the Chicago men, they were married to social researchers as well. I mean, William Thomas was married to one social researcher. Clark as well was helped with his wife, her own time, right? So that's interesting.
Yeah, I wonder if it's partly because of the ways in which married women were supposed to live as housewives rather than having their own active careers after marriage, and they wanted to make sure that their husbands will not tell them, you stay at home, I'm an engineer, I'm the one who is a breadwinner, and maybe they wanted to make sure that they can continue.
Yeah, but it was completely embedded in the gender culture of the US at that time. But at the same time, Grace Abbott, for example, we cannot say that her work was not considered in the US because she was nominated to go
That's right,
to Washington to head the newly it's like Children's Bureau.
Yes, she was highly appreciated by the administration, and she also represented the US in the League of Nations, with the Committee on Children's Rights.
So her work was acknowledged in some way, because otherwise she would have not been.
Yes, absolutely. That's right.
More question?
Yeah, actually, it's not.
Please.
Since you mentioned this middle class moralism that they were accused of, was there a religious or a church aspect to these women's social work engagement?
They were Protestants, that much I know. And I think Jane Addams, who was the co-founder of the heart of the Full House movement, she had a Quaker background, I think. So maybe Reformist Protestants and Catholics, that's my understanding of this. But they were quite irreligious, I think. Even Jane Addams became more like agnostic things during her directorship of the Full House.
Yeah, the ironic thing here is that the Chicago guys often were from religious background. For example, Elian Small, who founded the Department of Sociology in Chicago, was a former minister, and a lot of these guys were, often came from religious backgrounds of one sort or another. They insisted on this kind of epistemic break, they're scientific, so we don't need this religious stuff. Though they were still motivated a lot less religious motivations in the photo.
I have read somewhere that Chicago sociology background was a little more urban than was usually the case among the American social scientists. And also some of these sociologists were immigrants themselves, second generation. There was one from Romania, another one from Sweden. There's Anderson who wrote classics on the hobos. And they had a very first-hand experience of what it's like to be a immigrant in Chicago. But they were not devoid of moral papers themselves. You can see that in some of these publications where they discuss the vice in Chicago, for example, you can see that they try to communicate. You can see that sometimes appears in their writings.
And last comment about the fact that even within the field of social work, the women of Chicago, I mean, the graduate school, I mean, what was the school of civics and they became the graduate school for social administration, they were at odds with many different ways of doing social work at that time, and especially the way it was done at the School of Social Work in New York, which was more like based on caseworks and these practicalities of changing like social engineering the city. And the way they were doing social work at Chicago was a bit different, and they tried to theorize a little bit more than what was the case in social work at the time. So even within this female field, they were considered to be a bit separate. So that was interesting.
Yes, that's must be true. What I know about Edith Abbott was the leading figure in the social area. She disliked psychoanalysis, the idea of using psychoanalytic methods in social work. She thought it's a waste of time. So he did not favor psychological interpretations. Social, economic. She could have been Marxist if times would have been different. If they were no Marxist social scientists in the US at the time, not one of these sociologists was Marxist. We discussed it yesterday with Dennis.
Did they have any relationship in the feminist movements or women's movements of the time?
Yes, they have these feminist
meeting points of social work and
the whole house of activists. They were active in politics as well.
Well, Florence Kelly was a socialist, not a communist, socialist.
Yeah, they were active in the women's movement in Chicago. I think also nationalists, some of them. And the whole house was the hub. Jane Addams. We still have plenty of time because there's no third presentation, but maybe.
More question? Okay, thank you very much.